For days, whispers echoed through palace walls something was brewing, something devastating. Staff moved with nervous energy, royal aides cancelled appearances without explanation, and King Charles was nowhere to be seen. Then, in the early hours of the morning, a single encrypted call shattered the quiet. What it contained would not only break the king's heart, it would unravel the very fabric of the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The first signs of distress came not from Buckingham Palace, but from Clarence House, where King Charles had been staying longer than expected. His schedule, typically regimented and public, suddenly went dark. Meetings were cancelled, events postponed. Aides, who usually kept the royal machinery running with clockwork precision, began to exhibit signs of unease. Sources close to the royal household noted a series of late-night arrivals at Clarence House. Cars with tinted windows, faces too guarded to ignore, entered through the rear gates under the veil of darkness. And then came the call. A secure line, known only to a handful of people within the monarchy, rang at precisely 2:43 a.m. The voice on the other end was calm, but what it conveyed sent Charles into complete silence. He didn't speak, didn't move for several minutes. When he did, he asked to be left alone. In the hours that followed, a flurry of classified palace communications were marked with the highest level of urgency. Couriers were dispatched without explanation. Internal security teams repositioned, yet, outside the palace walls, the public remained unaware until Queen Camilla appeared at a charity event later that day. Known for her composure, Camilla's expression was brittle, as if she was forcing every smile through glass. Observers noticed her trembling hand and repeated glances at her phone. Something was undeniably wrong, but the official palace statement dismissed any rumors, stating simply that His Majesty is resting and attending to private matters. Still, whispers grew louder. Senior royal correspondents hinted at something deeply personal affecting the king. Staffers who typically refused comment were unusually tight-lipped. And then, a trusted royal aide, speaking under strict anonymity, let slip a chilling phrase. This changes everything. But the truth behind that fateful phone call would soon erupt into public view, and nothing could prepare the nation for what came next. Buried within the royal archives was a letter that had been sealed for decades, its very existence denied, its contents deemed too explosive. But now, in an extraordinary breach, it had found its way to King Charles, and what he read would shake him to his core. The letter, written in the final months of Queen Elizabeth II's life, had been intended for one pair of eyes, only her eldest son, Charles, and no one else. It was to be delivered after her passing, a final, intimate reflection from sovereign to successor, but something had gone wrong. Instead of a private moment of closure, the letter was leaked, its arrival not by royal messenger, but through a plain envelope, quietly slipped into Charles's personal study. The wax seal, unmistakable in its design, matched the Queen's private insignia, and the handwriting unmistakable. This was no forgery. This was real. And as Charles unfolded the parchment, the tremor in his hands betrayed more than curiosity. He sensed, somehow, that whatever was inside would not comfort him. And he was right. What began as a warm recollection of their shared memories took a sudden and devastating turn. The Queen, in her unmistakable prose, voiced lingering doubts about the institution, the people surrounding it, and, to Charles's disbelief, about him. Her words were not cruel, but they cut deeply. She expressed fear that Charles, despite decades of preparation, still lacked the unshakable steadiness the crown demanded. Then came the sentence that shattered him. "There are times, my dear Charles, when I have wondered if another may carry the burden better." The reference, though unnamed, was clear. William, the son the public had embraced, the prince the world had long seen as the face of the future. Charles sat in silence for hours, rereading his mother's words as if some alternate interpretation might soften the blow. But it was no use. She had written what she felt, and someone, somewhere, had ensured that those words reached him at the most vulnerable moment in his reign. The breach in royal protocol was staggering. No one outside a tight circle of archivists and royal advisors should have had access. And yet, someone had intercepted it, weaponized it, and detonated it straight into the heart of the monarchy. In the days that followed, a quiet paranoia spread through the palace. Every glance lingered a little too long. Every conversation felt layered with implication. Who had leaked it? Why now? And more urgently, what did they stand to gain? For Charles, it wasn't just the content of the letter that broke him. It was the realization that somewhere in his inner circle, betrayal had been carefully, surgically executed. And if his mother had doubted him, who else did? As Charles reeled from the personal betrayal, another force was gathering strength from the shadows, ready to challenge everything he thought was secure. While the king grappled with his grief, Prince William was reportedly holding covert meetings of his own, convening advisors, diplomats, and constitutional experts behind closed doors. The question wasn't just about succession anymore. It was about timing, power, and a shocking ultimatum. In the remote quiet of Norfolk, far from the gaze of flashing cameras and loyal courtiers, Prince William summoned a trusted circle. The location was deliberately chosen, secluded, fortified, and off the radar. Over a tense weekend, discussions unfolded that hadn't been entertained in generations. This was not a ceremonial gathering. It was a war council dressed in civility. William, the once reluctant heir, now sat at the head of a table, surrounded by the crown's most strategic minds. On the surface, they spoke in legalese terms like constitutional continuity and public confidence in sovereign leadership. But beneath the surface, the message was clear. A contingency was being drawn, and it pointed to a future without Charles on the throne. The trigger for this unprecedented move wasn't just the Queen's leaked letter or the King's spiraling emotional state. It was something buried deep within royal protocol, known only to a few, the so-called Stability Clause. Hidden in the folds of monarchical tradition, the clause allowed the Privy Council to discreetly intervene if the reigning monarch was seen as no longer fit physically, mentally, or politically to carry the burden of the crown. Until now, it had been a relic of another age. But suddenly, it was alive again, breathing down Charles's neck through whispered conversations and coded documents. Compounding this was the mounting pressure from the Commonwealth, where a growing chorus of voices called for a younger, more forward-facing leadership. Charles, to many abroad, represented continuity. William, they believed, could represent survival. Within palace walls, the emotional chasm between father and son widened. What had once been restrained formality turned to cold detachment. William's visits became infrequent. Their exchanges, brief and businesslike. There were no shouting matches, just silence thick with consequence. The air around the monarchy grew heavy with rumors. Royal insiders, once protective of their confidences, began leaking whispers to the press. Some claimed William was preparing to offer his father an ultimatum behind closed doors, a dignified transition cloaked as voluntary retreat. Others speculated a more confrontational path, where the palace itself would be forced to choose sides. Regardless of how it might unfold, one thing had become clear. The idea of an unbroken, lifelong reign had been shattered. William was not waiting. He was preparing. But just as whispers of abdication began to swirl, the next revelation would send the monarchy into a full-blown crisis. It wasn't just political behind the scenes. Charles was fighting something even more devastating. A private medical document, never meant to see the light of day, was leaked, and in it, a diagnosis that would explain everything. For months, questions had circled around the king's unpredictable public appearances, the sudden cancellations, the extended periods of seclusion. While palace aides offered polished explanations, fatigue, a need for rest, personal reflection, something more ominous had been unfolding beneath the surface. King Charles had received a diagnosis. Not an injury, not something recoverable, but a slow, creeping degenerative condition, rare, irreversible, and cruel. one that would, over time, erode both body and mind. And he had chosen to bear it in silence, hoping to manage the crown and his illness quietly, away from public scrutiny. But that silence was shattered when the confidential medical report was leaked to a select group of journalists, triggering a storm the monarchy could not contain. The document, though redacted, confirmed what many feared. The king's cognitive faculties would likely diminish over the next few years. Damage control efforts were immediate, but futile. Within hours, news outlets across the globe speculated on what this meant for leadership, stability, and succession. Charles, a man raised to endure, found himself vulnerable in the harshest light imaginable. And within his own family, the shock ran deeper than headlines could convey. William, who had already been preparing for a possible transition, was now forced to confront a future that had arrived too soon. Anne, ever the stalwart sibling, was said to have broken down privately, confessing to a close aide that she feared her brother would never finish what he began. The public, torn between sympathy and concern, erupted in a mix of mourning and debate. Supporters wept at the thought of a monarch being stripped of dignity by disease. Critics demanded answers, wondering how long the truth had been withheld. The crown, already under pressure from internal divisions and external voices, was now staring down an existential crisis fueled by uncertainty, emotion, and dread. And Charles, for all his composure, felt the weight of a terrible decision bearing down on him, to stay and fight, or to step aside for the good of the monarchy. Behind palace doors, the question was no longer if, but when, and who would make the call. Every passing day brought the reality closer. And while Charles remained outwardly stoic, those closest to him saw the inner unraveling. He had ruled for only a brief moment in history, but already, time was stealing from him. Yet as Charles wrestled with mortality, an old adversary returned to the stage, holding secrets that could destroy what little control he had left. No one expected Prince Harry to re-enter the fold, not like this. But a confidential document in his possession, one that had never been shared with the palace, now positioned him as a key figure in a growing royal storm. The document arrived at Buckingham Palace through a legal intermediary quietly, without fanfare, but bearing a name that hadn't been uttered in trusted royal circles in years. Princess Diana. It was one of her private letters, written during the height of her emotional turmoil, sealed and stored far from the reach of the institution that tried to erase the inconvenient parts of her legacy. Harry, it seemed, had kept it hidden all this time, tucked away in a personal archive, waiting, perhaps hoping that it would never need to be used. But now, with his father's health deteriorating and the monarchy splintering under pressure, he had made his move. The letter, allegedly handwritten in Diana's unmistakable script, revealed something shocking. In its final paragraphs, she spoke of her fears for the monarchy, of her children being weaponized by the crown, and most explosively, of who she believed was truly meant to lead. "William will wear the crown," she wrote. "But Harry has the heart for the people." Those words ignited a fire that no publicist or press release could extinguish. The palace, already staggering under leaks and speculation, was blindsided. King Charles, still reeling from health setbacks and betrayals within his own court, saw the move as a calculated attack. In a private meeting with his most trusted advisors, he was reported to have called it a knife in the back, accusing Harry of exploiting their mother's memory for political gain. And yet, there was no public statement, no direct retaliation, only silence thick with consequence, because in truth, the document had thrown everything into chaos. Was it a genuine plea from Diana? Was Harry using it as leverage? Or was it a desperate bid for reconciliation gone terribly wrong? Harry's motivations split opinion. Some believed he was reaching out, trying to bring light to a truth buried for decades. Others saw it as a ruthless move timed to exploit his father's vulnerability to destabilize an already crumbling institution. Even within the palace, reactions were deeply divided, but none more explosive than Camilla's. A leaked audio recording, captured during a private dinner, caught her railing against Harry's actions, calling them a disgrace to his mother's memory. The tone was raw, the language unfiltered. It was a moment of unguarded fury that quickly went viral and cast her in a harsh, unflinching light. The damage was done. Public trust, already fragile, now fractured even further. And within the royal household, battle lines had been redrawn this time, not between brothers or between monarch and heir, but between the ghosts of the past and the legacy of the future. But if Harry's return stirred chaos, what came next would utterly shatter the public's faith in the monarchy's future. In a move that blindsided the palace, the Archbishop of Canterbury abruptly announced his withdrawal from all royal duties, citing a crisis of conscience. Insiders say it wasn't just spiritual, it was political, and it was personal. The announcement came with no warning, no lead-up, no carefully crafted narrative to soften the blow. One moment, preparations were underway for a highly anticipated royal christening then, without so much as a formal statement to the king, the Archbishop pulled out. The event was cancelled entirely. Whispers of an ethical conflict emerged from Lambeth Palace, but they barely scratched the surface of what had truly shaken Britain's spiritual leader. Behind closed doors, something far deeper had unfolded. A private royal confession, reportedly given in confidence, had left the Archbishop reeling. It wasn't just the contents of the confession that disturbed him, it was what it implied about the monarchy's current trajectory. Sources close to the church revealed that the Archbishop had been approached weeks prior by a senior royal one, whose name has never officially been confirmed, though many point to Prince William. The meeting took place under a veil of secrecy, outside official venues, with no record on the royal calendar. What was discussed remains tightly guarded, but the result was unmistakable: a spiritual reckoning. The Archbishop, a man known for navigating complex moral terrains, now found himself unable or unwilling to preside over what he feared was a crumbling covenant between the crown and its conscience. His decision sent shockwaves through both church and monarchy. Not only did he cancel all scheduled duties involving the royal family, he went a step further, refusing to officiate any future coronation ceremonies under the current framework. The symbolism was staggering. For centuries, the Archbishop's blessing had been the divine thread binding sovereign to state. To walk away now wasn't just a refusal, it was an indictment. And while the official narrative was carefully sanitized, the unspoken message rang louder than any sermon. He no longer believed the crown held the moral authority it once claimed. Speculation reached fever pitch. What had the Archbishop been told that could compel such a dramatic severance? What sin had been confessed? What truth had been too devastating to reconcile with divine duty? The palace offered no answers, but in the silence, the public filled the void with theories. Others suspected a deeper fracture within the royal family, one that had turned the future king against his father in ways the public had yet to understand. Regardless of the specifics, one fact was now undeniable. The spiritual spine of the monarchy had snapped. As Britain's spiritual leadership crumbled, so too did its political foundation, leading to one final, unthinkable act. Deep within Westminster, a covert session of Parliament had been convened, a constitutional emergency cloaked in silence. When details leaked to the press, the monarchy faced something far more threatening than scandal: political exile. What began as quiet rumblings among senior members of Parliament soon spiraled into a full-blown institutional reckoning. Behind locked doors, away from cameras and ceremonial pretenses, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle gathered under the veil of urgency. The official reason was left deliberately vague, but those close to the inner circle knew better. The House was no longer simply watching the monarchy's unravelling, they were preparing for the aftermath. At the heart of the emergency session was a single, deeply unsettling question. Could the nation afford to continue under the rule of a king whose grip, physically, emotionally, and politically, was slipping away? Private communications obtained by select members outlined preliminary measures for a temporary regency, one that would quietly shift executive power away from Charles without triggering a full-blown abdication. What made the situation all the more dire was the revelation that the king had been entirely excluded from these discussions. The palace was not briefed. No formal notice was delivered. The sovereign was being written out of the nation's political script behind his back, one page at a time. And as these secret moves unfolded, another front was cracking open: the Commonwealth. Several member nations, already weary from years of royal turbulence, began issuing carefully worded statements of concern. The tone was diplomatic. The message was not. There were questions about continuity, trust, and the relevance of the monarchy's symbolic leadership in the modern era. And in private, some had begun drafting proposals to hold referendums on whether to sever ties with the crown altogether. Then came the most devastating blow of all, a leaked memo, marked confidential, suggesting that royal privileges were under urgent review. It detailed proposed limits to sovereign immunity, public funding, and ceremonial powers. The memo, dated weeks before the Archbishop's withdrawal, was written with chilling precision. This wasn't speculation. It was preparation. The monarchy wasn't just being questioned, it was being restructured, dismantled piece by piece under the watchful eyes of politicians who no longer believed in its permanence. Inside Buckingham Palace, panic surged. An internal investigation was launched to identify the source of the leak. Tensions reached a boiling point as suspicion circled the very heart of the institution. Who had betrayed the crown from within? And how deep did the rot go? Trust, once a fragile commodity, now shattered entirely. And just when it seemed nothing more could go wrong, a final betrayal would drive the knife even deeper. Late one evening, an unverified audio file began circulating in media circles. In it, Queen Camilla could allegedly be heard expressing doubts not only about Charles's leadership, but about the monarchy's survival itself. The leak would ignite a firestorm from which the palace may never recover. The recording, barely 3 minutes long, tore through the British establishment like a bolt of lightning. Initially dismissed as fabricated, it gained swift credibility when analysts matched the voice to previous off-mic captures of Queen Camilla, confirming it was not only real, it was recent. Captured during a private dinner with longtime confidants at an undisclosed estate, the conversation was never meant for public ears. Yet within its hushed tones lay revelations that would deliver a direct blow to the royal family's already fractured foundation. In the clip, Camilla's voice at once composed and cutting details her growing concern over Charles's ability to rule. "He's not the man he once was," she says, "and I fear we're watching him slip away while the world watches us crumble." But it was what followed that left Buckingham Palace in shambles. Camilla continues, stating, "William must take over soon. It's not about titles anymore, it's about survival." That single line, a quiet, searing endorsement of Charles's abdication, sent a shockwave through the monarchy. It wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a constitutional insult. For a queen consort to publicly undermine the reigning king, even in private, signaled a fracture so deep it threatened the entire institution. And Camilla didn't stop there. When the conversation turned to Harry, her tone darkened. She reportedly blamed him for igniting a cultural war from abroad and accused him of fueling the palace's collapse to settle personal vendettas. By morning, the story dominated global headlines. Every media outlet ran with it. Commentators dissected every syllable. Royal watchers speculated on Camilla's true intentions. Was she trying to force Charles's hand? Was this a strategic leak or an intimate moment weaponized by someone within her own circle? The public reaction was swift and ferocious. Former supporters turned critics. Protests broke out outside royal residences, and within hours, the palace issued a rare internal lockdown. Phones confiscated, devices scanned, communications restricted, but it was already too late. The personal cost was immediate. Insiders reported a heated confrontation between Charles and Camilla behind closed doors, one that ended with Camilla leaving the residence indefinitely. Their public schedule was cleared. Appearances were cancelled. And a single line in a palace press release confirmed what many feared. Their Majesties will be spending time apart. For a monarchy already unravelling under the pressure of health, betrayal, and public scrutiny, this scandal pierced the final layer of unity, holding it all together. But in the end, it wasn't the press, the politicians, or the princes who made the final move. It was the king himself. In a nationally televised address that stunned the world, King Charles stepped forward, not as a monarch clinging to power, but as a father, a son, and a man at the end of a devastating chapter. His words would rewrite royal history forever. The nation watched in silence. The world held its breath. It was just past 8 p.m. when the palace interrupted scheduled programming with a royal insignia and a brief announcement. His Majesty the King will now address the nation. For many, it felt like the hush before a storm. And then, Charles appeared not behind a gilded desk or flanked by symbols of authority, but alone, stripped of the ceremonial armor that once defined his reign. What followed was not a speech, it was a confession, a reckoning, and a final act of courage. In a trembling yet resolute voice, Charles declared an immediate reduction in his royal duties, stating plainly that the time had come to pass the torch. With dignity, he announced the initiation of a formal transition of power to Prince William, framing it not as a surrender, but as a sacred duty to ensure stability and trust in the monarchy's future. His words carried the weight of a lifetime, one spent preparing for a role that, in the end, he could only hold briefly. "I have tried," he said, "to be the monarch this country deserves. But there comes a moment when love for one's country demands that we let go for its good, not our pride." He did not shy away from his failures. He spoke openly of regrets, of moments where silence replaced strength, where protocol buried compassion. He acknowledged the cracks in the institution, the fractures within the family, and the toll it had taken on his health, his spirit, and his sense of self. The burden of unseen pain. He called it words that left even the most hardened commentators visibly moved. Then came the tributes. To his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, he offered reverence and sorrow, thanking her for the impossible shoes he had tried to fill. And to Diana, his voice cracked. "She remains the pulse of our shared memory," he said, "and in the hearts of our sons her legacy endures." Across the country, the impact was immediate. In living rooms and pubs, on street corners and online forums, viewers wept. Some in gratitude, others in heartbreak. Behind the scenes, royal family members reportedly watched the address in separate rooms, and yet, their emotional reactions were unified tears, silence, and the weight of knowing that history had just shifted course before their eyes. Charles ended the address with a single, unforgettable line: "The crown is not the man, it is the people." With that, the screen slowly faded to black, and a moment of national reflection began. This wasn't just the end of a reign, it was the end of an era and the beginning of a storm no crown could withstand. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.